right. It is a couple minutes after, so we'll go ahead and get started while more people filter in. So thank you for joining us today. This is the third talk in the Center for Quantum Networks seminar series that we hold monthly. We're very excited this month to have Jane Baumbauer giving our talk on the Quantum Network Society. She is the CQN's Deputy Director for Societal Impact. She is a professor of law at the University of Arizona, and her research assesses the social costs and benefits of big data, surveillance, and communication technologies. She is actively involved with efforts to design privacy laws that support the development and adoption of responsible AI. And she holds a BS in mathematics from Yale College and a JD from Yale Law School. So go ahead and let her get started here in a second. Just a quick reminder, please have your microphones off during the seminar session. And then towards the end, once we open it up for Q&A, you can go ahead and turn your mics off as you need to ask questions. And you can always ask questions in the chat if needed, and we can read those out loud if you don't want to do it yourself. So Jane, the floor is yours. I'll let you go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks very much, Russ, and welcome everyone. This talk is going to try to lay out in a little more detail than the previous two talks did in this seminar how quantum technologies are likely to be used in the near or middle future, and how, more importantly, how those uses might affect people. About 2/3 of the way through the talk, I'm going to switch to focus on the policy themes that have kind of struck me as the most important ones. So my goal here is to give sort of a bird's eye view of the categories of policies that might be significantly affected by quantum technologies, and especially quantum communications, if they do what we think they'll do today, or what we think today they will do. And the reason I think it's worthwhile to organize by themes of societal implications is that if you look at any one quantum technology in isolation, it might not reveal the full story or the full impact. So, warning, of course, I am relying on predictions of applications that might turn out to be wrong, either because they turn out to be impossible, like cold fusion was or is, or because the most valuable application is something other than what we're thinking about today, as is often the case in emerging technologies. So it poses an interesting challenge to us as a center. How are we going to plan for or even study potential societal impacts with the right level of self-awareness, knowing that we're trying to study something that's inherently unknowable? How confident can we even be that advanced planning is going to be more beneficial than harmful? This is one reason that we want lots of eyes on our work when we do the societal impact research here at the Center for Quantum Networks. And we're actively seeking diversity in perspectives, in methodology, in training, and in all sorts of ways to make sure that we have lots of perspectives. So if you attended the previous talks, then you know that Mike Raymer and Saikat Guha have already described a lot of the applications that I'll be going over again today. I'll actually be using, whoops, let me see here. I'll be using Mike's, I'll be using Mike's three-part, well, I thought I was going to be using Mike's three-part slide on the various types of applications: quantum computing, quantum communications, and quantum networks, but quantum sensors. But it looks like that slide actually isn't appearing. I think it's locked in locked mode. So that's okay. We're going to start with quantum communications because these are the ones that these are the applications that have the most direct relevance to what the Center for Quantum Networks is doing. So right now, although we have lots of data security problems, our communications are pretty secure when they're in transmission, and that's thanks to public key encryption. Messages can be encrypted using a recipient's public key, and they can't be decrypted unless a person has the private key, which the recipient or recipient's agent will have. So even the ISPs, the basic internet service providers, don't have access to the content of the messages. And that means that hackers and spies have to go find other vulnerabilities, like impersonating the recipient or something like that, in order to get the message. That's going to change when quantum computing matures, because with large enough quantum processors, a lot of public key encryption that's in use today is going to be vulnerable to brute force attack for the first time. So an eavesdropper with the improvement of quantum computing will be able to copy the hashed data and then feed it to a quantum computer and get the message in a plain text format some short time later. The advantages of quantum secured communications come from the quantum qualities of entanglement and the no cloning theorem that Mike talked about. So Alice and Bob have entangled qubits that they'll use to create a cipher, a shared, fundamentally random private key. And Bob's going to derive the key using his qubits, and then also a series of measurement outcomes that Alice can send over the classical internet. So that means that the basic internet service provider does not know the quantum states. They only know the outcomes of the measurements. And so that means they don't have the key, because those measurements are salted with basically nonsense that neither Bob nor Alice are going to use. And if you want to understand this better, I encourage you to watch Psychot's presentation from last month, which is available on our YouTube channel. Okay, so the snoop, though, is stuck too, because even if she had access to the entangled qubits, like physical access to it, she still couldn't copy them. And if she took her own measurements using the qubits, then Alice and Bob would know that their communications are compromised. And so that's a pretty elegant way to secure the channel of communications. But that's not to say that it's a total panacea, because for the foreseeable future, most of us are still going to be working and communicating with classical computers. And so we're going to store information in digital form. And that classical data storage is going to be vulnerable to attacks of various sorts, just as it is today. So in a way, what QKD is doing is it's an effort with anticipation of quantum computing getting better to make sure that we can at least tread water, that we can at least keep our data secure while it's in transmission, as it is for the most part today. But the extent, to the extent that quantum communication, quantum key distribution works as well as we're hoping that it's going to also introduce some problems that are at least somewhat novel. So, it's not just the good. We've been talking about Alice and Bob as if they're good guys and the spy is the bad guy, but that might not be. Criminal conspiracies use secured communications too. And so QKD is going to complicate the work of the FBI or signals intelligence agents at the NSA, or really any sort of person who might have a legitimate reason to intercept a communication based on, for example, a well-supported wiretap warrant or something. So I don't want to overstate this problem, because today the FBI and NSA already have some difficulty accessing communications, because most people, and especially sophisticated criminal rings, already use encryption services. So, so that means that even using the encryption services that are popular today, the FBI can't just go to a basic internet service provider and say, hey, here's a warrant, give us the communications that belong to this address. They're going to have to find some other way to either get the encryption key or collect the messages in some other method. So this is known as the going dark problem in security circles. However, the FBI still has a lot of options today. So if a target of their investigation is using something that is using an encryption service that itself participates or rather complies with a wiretap warrant. So like if, for example, they're using Gmail, then the FBI can go to Google with their warrant and ask Google to decrypt the Gmail communications. But for the very same, however, many criminals and non-criminals as well, by the way, are starting to use encryption services that actually reside on the devices. So these are end-to-end encryption services like Signal, if you know the application Signal, that uses end-to-end encryption so that the encryption is done on the sender's and receiver's device. So that would mean, when as people move to those types of device-based encryption services, then the FBI is already a little bit stuck. In order to actually get access to messages, they'd have to make a pretend company that builds devices that secretly copies both encryption keys and the messages and sends them off and stores them for later analysis. And if you think that sounds far-fetched, the FBI has actually done that. And so the FBI and the NSA do have some ingenuity. Presumably they'll have some when we move to QKD as well, but suffice it to say that there's going to be some sort of implication, some darkening of the going dark problem when it comes to security like the FBI. Okay. Another problem that we might be wanting to think about is when we should start protecting the data that we send today, because it's entirely possible that some bad actor is collecting sensitive data today with the hope that in the future it will still be valuable to them. And then once they get access to quantum computing, they can then decrypt it and figure out what it said. So, and that the problem is even greater if we combine quantum computing services with quantum communications and expect that this hacker will be able to run their program without even the owner of the quantum computer knowing what they're doing, right? So, so when and how should we start applying post-quantum classical encryption? That's going to be an important question too. Okay. And now I want to move on to quantum sensors because, well, I should say that there are probably going to be other applications of quantum communications that take advantage of the sending of qubits. Things like implementing a set of rules for auctions or for algorithms that use data inputs as qubits so that even the owner of the algorithm doesn't know the information. I think there are many more applications that we're going to be finding along the way as we start applying what we know about quantum information theory. Okay, but let's talk about sensing, because these are the applications that Chris Hufenagel at Berkeley has called the killer app of quantum technologies, and I think he's right. Mike Raymer in the very first talk in this series talked about many of these sensors. So Mike already talked about many of these sensors. Gravity sensors, there are a lot of different things that can be sensed using quantum sensors, and they can be sensed with greater precision and efficiency than the sensors that we're currently using can do. So let's start with quantum accelerometers. These can be used, as Mike explained, to design satellite-free navigation and tracking. So that means that some of the problems with GPS jamming or being susceptible to denial of service attacks might go away. It also means that it has privacy implications, because if we can do GPS in device, then there isn't as much data of a data stream for others, third parties to collect. We can also use the technology to make synchronized atomic clocks that won't need to be recalibrated for like 1 billion years and will be synced with each other. And this is useful anytime that we need super precise timestamps for events that are occurring in different locations. So one application, for example, might be to prevent arbitrage, time-based arbitrage on the stock market. Okay, telescopes. Quantum interferometers can be used to make measurements and images of space with greater precision or greater distance. And we can even put them on satellites to get to measure even more distant objects. And that's really cool, although I can't say that I understand what the societal impacts will be. That's pretty far in the future. But if we imagine those satellites pointing some of the sensors inward instead of outward, things get a little more interesting for policy wonks like me. So quantum sensors can do things like measure precise gravitational fields, including objects that aren't visible or are below the surface or are in the ocean, like submarines. So that means that state secrets are going to be more difficult to maintain. You know, if we put weapon systems underground, they can't really be kept hidden from any other states that have this type of technology. Some emergency operations might become easier to manage, like we might at least stop losing entire airliners, for example. Weather forecasting will get more precise, more accurate. Scouting for natural resources is going to become easier and therefore cheaper, but also probably more environmentally careful, which is all good. Trade secrets, for the same reason national security secrets would be a little harder to protect from aerial surveillance, the same is true of trade secrets. And of course, to the extent that these sensors are used to track people or their personal items, then privacy is going to be implicated as well. So all of these applications put pressure on international relations and cooperation. So if we don't want a space fight, then that's another dimension of what we need to think about as we start using sensors in this way. Okay, there are lots of cool biomedical applications. One exciting example is a low power CAT scan or imaging devices that we can imagine getting the same amount of information, but with much, much smaller amounts of radiation than we currently have to use, like 1 million times less radiation. That means that medical scans that we currently do today can be done either much more safely or much more precision, or both, you know, hopefully higher resolution and much safer. Given those efficiency savings, we might even imagine developing wearable CAT scanners that allow for long-term medical monitoring. You know, imagine if a patient with MS, for example, could take brain scans every day. And the sensors could send the data to clinicians or maybe even to medical AI powered by quantum computers, who knows, to provide dynamic personalized care that's constantly using real-time data to give real-time instructions and maybe even treatment changes to the patient. Other types of portable quantum scanners could perform spectrometry with small handheld devices instead of the type of equipment we have to use today. So that might be useful for, again, bringing costs down for medical diagnosis or having handheld or even, you know, phone-based apps for some of these things. Detecting food contamination. Right now we waste a lot of food knowing that there's been a contamination somewhere. And detecting pollution in our air or water supplies. One of the most exciting things, okay, so finally, let's talk about quantum computers, which also has a lot of very exciting applications. These allow for all sorts of processing of pattern recognition problems and optimization problems that today would take much too long on even a supercomputer, or at least theoretically, that's what we're expecting. There have already been some proof of concept papers showing how quantum computers can solve problems that were previously intractable, like the protein folding problem, to help design new drug therapies. Quantum sensors and computers, we can imagine them working together to really shepherd the promise of personalized medicine that we've been hearing a lot about, but that has started, but is moving a bit slowly. We can imagine that with use of both sensors and quantum computers, we could design the right drug based on the particular biology of the patient and the environment in which that patient's going to be. Mike mentions that quantum computers can optimize energy grids or our communications networks, or all sorts of systems basically that have multifaceted goals. And so optimization in itself is hard to, requires a complex model, and that requires using too much information at one time. So maybe the quintessential example of this might be smart cities, right? So we might have the potential to design a truly smart city where autonomous vehicles are equipped with entangled LiDAR even, that can connect wirelessly to the quantum internet for secured, data security. And they can receive instructions, maybe even from a quantum computing algorithm, or in any case, some sort of powerful AI that can help manage traffic flow. And while we're at it, since we're living in my fantasy universe, let's go ahead and put the cars underground and make use of those on-device GPS systems, so that we can return our roads and our streets to pedestrian and park use and whatnot. Coming back to reality for a second, though, even if we had all of the technology to do this kind of, to implement this kind of smart city, there's still really important decisions that need to be made that would be hard. So for one thing, we could optimize for lots of different goals, and we might not disagree on which ones we want to optimize for. So should we be optimizing based on the fastest travel times if we're going to have smart cars driving around? Or do we want to factor in environmental impact? Do we want to embed some of the rules about favoring carpooling, for example? Do we want commuters who come from, who are low-income workers to have any advantages? Or do we want time-sensitive destinations like hospitals or airports to get an advantage in our design? All of these are debatable and will be debated. And then even if we agree on what we want to optimize, there's also the question of whether we want to optimize it at an individual or collective level. What I mean is, let's say that we decide, okay, we just want to optimize for travel times. Well, do we want to make sure that each individual has the shortest travel time that they could get, so that there's no incentive for them to opt out and drive on their own path? Or do we want to optimize at the collective level, which would mean that some individuals might have an incentive to opt out and go take some different driving course? This is something that Uber and Google Maps and whatnot struggles with today. And then if we do decide that we want a centralized system because it has some efficiency advantages and some managerial advantages and whatnot, well, then it raises some questions about collectivization of this sort. So what do we do with people who want to be holdouts and want to not participate? Do we at some point force them to participate? Also, if we're centralizing data collection and analysis and instructions, that's going to aggregate a lot of authority and a lot of data into one entity. So how do we manage that entity to make sure that there aren't too many ways to abuse power? Okay. And then are there going to be unintended consequences, like we've seen from some new applications like Uber, where people no longer have as much interest, for example, in using public transportation, or I'm sure there are a range of other unintended consequences as well. So I'm elaborating at some length on this particular example, mostly as an exercise to show how even when there's lots of upside potential, that's great. But bringing those benefits into fruition is going to be a feat not only for scientists and engineers, but for social adaptation and planning as well. None of the questions that I just went through are entirely new. They all have some analogs to technological shocks that have taken place in the past, but they might burst our hope that we can kind of just engage in an incrementalist approach. Like if we just incrementally adapt to these technologies, then there could be a path dependence that forecloses us from harnessing some of the advantages that we could have built up if we had planned in advance. So this raises the sort of time-old question of how much planning it makes sense to do in advance. Okay, and all of this, by the way, is going to be potentially affecting lots of different industries all at once, because we're hoping and expecting that quantum computers, quantum sensors, and quantum networks are going to spawn this large and lively open research space and marketplace, where lots of different app developers can be putting their expertise in making use of these technologies in whatever direction they want to go in. So given that we're likely to see applications affecting all industries all at once, much like the classical internet did, I have found it useful to start organizing my thoughts around broad themes of the type of impact that the quantum technologies in their various forms are likely to have. So one obvious one that we've spent some time on already is national security. Given that they're, we've already talked about data security. Quantum computing is a threat to the security of the communications of our own government, of our own financial institutions, and other critical infrastructure. Quantum key distribution and quantum networks is going to help, right? But those factors get reversed when we think about signals intelligence. So when it comes to the US being on the offensive and trying to collect the communications of others, well, then quantum computing will help, and the others' access to quantum key distribution will hinder the efforts of, say, the NSA. Aerial surveillance will become easier for us with the use of quantum sensing. But because all of these have the sort of thing where there's a lot of advantage to hoarding the technology and using it in the US before other nation states, even our allies, have access to it. Because of that, there's been increasing pressure from the federal government to maintain any advantage we might have in the development. So using export controls and really aggressively enforcing them to make sure that knowledge at least about certain technologies doesn't seep out, and closing borders to highly skilled immigrants might be an increasingly troubling trend if many states, if many countries are trying to hoard the capacity that they already have to develop this new technology. Privacy, you've heard me mention privacy a few times already. So quantum technologies are going to both increase and decrease privacy. So some things like QKD and device-based GPS are going to increase it. But a lot of things, especially quantum sensors, are going to pose threats. Also, a lot of AI applications are going to need, de facto, they're going to require a lot of data that's connected to, or at least potentially connected to, individuals in order to run systems well. That's going to put a lot of strain on the concept of consent, which is what currently sits at the center of most modern privacy laws. So to take the smart city as an example, could we really say that individuals have the power to withhold their consent from data collection if they're going to need to allow data collection and processing as a condition for using a vehicle? I doubt it. I think that that's not a useful way to think about consent. And so it means that we're going to have to reconceptualize potentially what we're trying to get out of privacy law. While we're on the topic of AI, AI fairness is also worth studying with quite a bit of rigor here at the center. There's a whole field of interdisciplinary research right now called FAT, Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. And the researchers in this field, and Catherine Brooks and I, who run our quantum society research here, are both part of it. One goal is to try to identify and tackle the issues that come up when our machine learning algorithms are too complicated for us to fully understand and predict in advance. A lot of the work today focuses on unintended biases that can come out when machine learning algorithms are used to score people or make decisions about people, various sorts. So for example, algorithms that are used to recommend hospital care or triage decisions have been trained using historical data, and then as a result, African-American patients tend to receive worse care, inferior care, less testing, and have worse health outcomes. And it's because the recommendation systems tend to steer them towards things that African-Americans have been steered toward in the past. This isn't because machine learning has been trained to use race necessarily. It might not even have access to race data, but rather it uses factors that correlate strongly enough with race such that the error that tends to push people toward unnecessary treatment falls disproportionately on white patients, and the error that tends to deny patients treatment that would actually be helpful for them, that tends to disproportionately affect Black patients. So there are lots of examples of these kinds of biases that have been emerging, and lots of creative ways to find them and correct for them. But the correction is no easy task because there are many different forms of bias, and they are sometimes in direct conflict with each other. So that if you fix one form of bias, you might be exacerbating another form. And biases can often be reduced somewhat by increasing access to data, so that accuracy across the board can improve. But then we wind up going back into conflicts with privacy. So it's a really tremendously interesting but difficult field to grapple with. Okay, AI systems sometimes are also trusted too much. This is the deceptively inaccurate quality of them. So if machines are presumed to be kind of all-knowing, when of course we know that they do have error, this could in itself be a problem, too much trust. However, every time AI is critiqued in the popular media or in conversations that I'm involved in, I tend to encourage people not to think about AI ethics and fairness in a vacuum. If we ditch AI because it causes biased error, for example, we might wind up relying on Cuban systems that have even more error and are less accurate. So increasingly, I think we're going to be measuring the fairness of an AI system, not against an abstract kind of perfection, but against other AIs, and asking which type of training, machine learning training and algorithm is most likely to get us where we want to be. Okay, infrastructure policy. We can use some of the themes that made regulating and managing broadband and the classical internet to understand what we're likely to run up against as we roll out the quantum internet. For a while, repeaters and quantum memories and high quality optical fiber and the sorts of stuff we're going to need to build a quantum internet, they're going to be expensive. So naturally that raises questions about who's going to build the backbone for a quantum internet. I suspect the government's going to pick up a lot of that tab, but then we have to ask where we want to use public funds to locate this new infrastructure. And then how is it going to interact with and sync up with privately owned utility companies? To get a private company to make investments in really expensive equipment like optical fiber, the government might have to give some assurances, as they once did for cable and broadband companies, that the companies will be shielded to some degree from competition long enough to at least collect their investment. And so that's one reason that those of us who grew up in the 90s or early 2000s are have grown so accustomed to really lousy customer service from our broadband providers. So we might ask whether simultaneous investment and development of satellite-based and ground-based quantum computing, quantum networks, I'm sorry, might be valuable not only to see sort of what works better, but just to have two modes of communication being developed simultaneously to infuse a little bit of competition. Equitable access. Okay, so what can we learn from the big broadband gap that we still have and have struggled to close? What can we learn from that experience in order to not create as much of a quantum gap, so that rural communities or disadvantaged communities of various sorts can have some of the can have access to some of the benefits that everyone else does. And then internet governance, internet protocols today are refined through this international multi-stakeholder process, that standards board. And that might be the right process, but it's worth asking ourselves if that's so, or if there are any ways to improve that, internet governance as well. Health policy. Almost done here, and I'll make sure to leave some time for Q&A. All right, so there's lots of upside potential when it comes to health-related applications. You probably noticed how excited I was when I was describing them. But there are some interesting ways to think about how changes might emerge. So right now, apps and devices that help with diagnosis or treatment, they're regulated by the FDA as devices. But in time, with quantum sensors and AI of the sort of system that I was describing earlier, they might make doctors somewhat irrelevant. I'm allowed to say that because AI is also going to make lawyers less relevant, and so all of us professionals, I think, our days are numbered, or rather, the nature of our work is going to change. But the interesting thing is that we actually have two very different regimes for regulating doctors from how we regulate devices. So if the role of doctors starts getting subsumed by tech, do we want to regulate that tech the way we currently are with FDA, basically under the rules of FDA devices? Or do we want to borrow some of what we learn from regulating doctors as a profession, or make some sort of hybrid system? While we're thinking about it, while we're thinking about the FDA at least, we might ask whether drugs should be whether drugs should be regulated and pre-screened the way we always have, using human trials. That might not make sense if we're expecting drugs to be customized to the particular biology and reaction of each patient. So there's lots of room, though, I think it's clear, to make healthcare cheaper and safer with quantum technologies. But so that brings me to the political economy problem, which is that there are going to be a lot of people who have a vested interest in keeping the industry more or less the way it is today. If you don't believe me, consider that at the federal government level, which is where we regulate Medicare, of course, and drugs and health insurance. The health industry spends far more than any other industry on lobbying. And that's also true. Doctors tend to dominate lobbying at the state level, and state legislatures are the ones that regulate doctors. So if we're thinking about the advancement of these technologies, we might also want to prepare for and expect that there's going to be some resistance and some protectionism mobilized around policymakers. Oops, okay, I meant to show, yeah. So those are all the fields that are related to healthcare. Okay. Okay, innovation more generally. Do we think quantum technologies, either the hardware or the various applications that use quantum technologies, do we think that these are going to produce winner-take-all sorts of markets? And if so, what does that mean in terms of our antitrust and competition policy? A lot of people can make a lot of people will probably be able to make quantum computing based AIs or new applications using quantum sensors that do things other than what the original producers of those sensors or quantum computers had originally anticipated. So another type of risk we need to think about are just the sorts of risks that emerge when we're getting a lot of innovation in all directions all at once. So historically, the US has tended to embrace permissionless innovation. That's a term Adam Tierer uses. So what I mean by that is that we've created sort of legal allowances, sometimes even literally legal safe harbors to protect new industries from liability while they figure out what they can do. That's the case certainly with internet platforms, like if you've heard of the debates around CDA Section 230, which protects platforms like Facebook from civil liability. But this goes back, it's a history that goes back much further than that. So even our old tort doctrines were quite lenient and protective of new industries during industrialization. Do we want to continue doing that? Do we want to encourage innovation fast and then do cleanup work afterwards? Or is there some sort of pre-approval system that might slow down the marketplace a little bit, but in a way that might ultimately redound to our benefit? Okay, it's also worth thinking about studying how technology might improve or frustrate the act of regulation itself. As a lawyer and law professor, at least, my mind naturally turns to these sorts of questions. So technology has a tendency to break assumptions that are built into the way we regulate. I talked already about, for example, drug approval processes as the FDA. Some assumptions are going to be broken there, but there are lots of ways in which we assume, for example, that drivers need to be able to see, or that drivers need to be insured, or need to travel at low speeds, and all of these might be open to questions if technologies, if quantum sensing and communications technologies get really good. Another set of interesting questions from a regulatory perspective is complexity. So initially, I think as these quantum technologies and applications are emerging, they're likely to increase the complexity, the complexity of society and therefore of the laws that have to be developed to manage them. But is it possible that rules could in the future become simpler, with the expectation that if we just make the rules plain and clean, then the technologists will have to figure out how to comply with them. For example, right now we have lots of detailed traffic laws and liability rules. Would we be able in the near future to set a rule that says, okay, if there's a collision if there's an accident with injuries or with damage, whichever vehicle was driving with the greatest force is going to have to pay, that the manufacturer of that vehicle has to pay, right? That's a simple rule. And could we then expect that the markets and the technologists to sort of take over to get the system working right? Machines as regulators. Okay, so right now we're having an ethical debate about whether it's okay to let machines make some really consequential decisions that human authorities like police officers and judges or employers used to make. At some point, and I'm pretty confident it's going to be sooner than people expect, we're going to be debating the opposite. We're going to be asking whether it's ethical to allow humans to keep making these decisions, given our kind of inconsistent human nature. To show you what I mean, and to show you that I'm not a complete loony, consider law enforcement. So if law enforcement in the future can use quantum sensors to detect contraband or weapons without revealing anything else that's legal and private, and if AI can do a better job than experienced police officers can at predicting who's dangerous or even assessing probable cause, why would we even want police officers to continue playing that role? So we might wind up adding police officers to the long list of professionals, along with doctors and lawyers who may be out of a job sometime. So that brings me to like labor policy and tax implications. So another lively debate we're having right now is whether we should consider something like a universal basic income, but the anticipation that a lot of work is going to become redundant. And by the way, historically, this theme has come up a lot where we think that some new technology is going to destroy all the jobs, and it hasn't. It has just changed the nature of the jobs. But it might be worth considering whether we want to preserve work for its own sake, whether there's something intrinsically valuable about work such that we want to encourage it, or whether there's not, and such that actually something like a universal basic income would allow us to prosper without spending the best hours of our day at a job that might not be fulfilling. So if income is more level, can we channel people's instinct to want to create and want to compete in a healthy way? Can we channel that into something that's more cultural or socially, towards some social goal rather than a market goal? These are, I'm now way off in pretty futurist types of questions, but doing these debates with the precision of a broad base of social scientists, as we're pulling together here at the Center for Quantum Networks, is going to help us, because as we figure out at least the key questions in those types of futurist topics, it will help nearer term decisions that have to be made about the design or regulation of technology. Okay, last slide along these themes of impact is the sort of psychological dimension. So all breakthrough technologies, and I'm sure quantum technologies will not be any different, that they tend to overexcite people. So some people are going to be suspicious, and they're going to find or invent evidence of health risks or of conspiratorial collusion or something like that. And some of those health risks and some of those conspiracy theories will be true, but a lot of them won't be. And then there's also going to be the problem on the other side, that there will be some people who are overly optimistic and that really believe that the technology is going to do things it won't be able to do. I might be contributing to that with this talk. So disciplines like the history of science or psychology, I think they can help us as a center channel some of that into a healthy direction. They can help us correct for these types of problems of over optimism or over pessimism, and figure out how to have a constructive and healthy amount of skepticism. So when you look at all these things together, first of all, to some extent they interact with each other, and then they suggest that there are a range of responses. We might respond in terms of the design of the technology itself. We might expect markets themselves to manage some of these issues. We might expect lawmakers to have to manage them. Or we might think that, well, we're just going to adjust, we're just going to use social norms to adjust and adapt to these technologies. My guess is that we will often use some kind of messy combination of all four of those, and that might be, realistically the best way to cope anyway. One last thing, overall, my talk has been pretty much descriptive, but I do want to get across one normative or prescriptive point. In a lot of cases, quantum technologies are going to be putting more pressure on a category of social or policy problem that we already have. And I think this is important to point out because these themes like privacy or fairness, fairness in decision-making, or innovation policy, these themes come up over and over again because they are legitimately hard. They're hard problems. They require trade-offs between social goals that are important. And so while I don't know, I won't say in this talk what I think the optimal solution is or optimal response is to any of these problems. I think it behooves the center to be highly skeptical of any strong claims that there is one right policy answer or response. That there may indeed be a few use cases where we know for sure that quantum technologies, when used in a particular way, are all bad or all good, and nothing to worry about. But a lot of times, if there's even a debate that's starting to emerge, it's probably because the technology has tapped into and has raised a question that's genuinely hard and tough to answer, and so that's all the more reason that we want to involve as many social scientists as well as the public and engineers and scientists into these conversations as possible. All right, I think I have a few minutes to take questions.
Yep. Mike, I know you, Dr. Raymer, I know you had a question. I don't know if you wanted to jump on, or we can read it from the chat if you'd like.
Yeah, I can just answer the question. Are you hearing me okay, Russ?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So my question is that new technology always gives people more power to do things, for better or worse. And for quantum technology, I wonder about the balance between giving more power to individuals versus giving more power to governments and large corporations. Because in the near future, quantum technology is very expensive and will not be available to individuals. But in the long run, just like everything else, once the individuals get access to it, that changes the balance of power. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think quantum technologies are likely to have some similarities to the types of technological shocks that have happened before. I think the classical internet is probably one example, or is a natural analogy. But it will probably also have its own factors. But usually there are simultaneous concentrations of power and democratization of power. And I think that's going to be true here too. So quantum computing, in terms of the hardware, controlling the hardware, is probably going to be expensive for a long time. And for that reason, I sort of applaud the companies that are already investing heavily in it, like Google and IBM. I applaud them for making access fairly, at least right now, freely available. But in time, just like cloud servers, I'm sure that there's going to be a pay model, and so we'll have to think about that. But at the same time, it's a good example as well to show that even while that power might be concentrated, the power that currently is invested in dominant firms in medical care or in almost any, in almost any industry you can think about, might be challenged and might be democratized and might be open to genuine, beneficial, constructive disruption through competition. So I've heard some pessimistic accounts that quantum technology is going to make Google even more powerful and whatnot. I mean, who knows? But I have my doubts, in part because we already seem to be on a model where we expect developers to have access to quantum computing, and therefore develop their own applications and make money off of it and provide access to others. And I'd also say more generally, it's hard to measure these things, but oftentimes, even when there's a dominant firm in some kind of new tech space, there are positive externalities that are so great that I worry a little bit about jumping too quickly to the conclusion that tech companies, for example, need to be broken up, or that big is inherently bad. It might be, but it just requires some care to make sure we're not missing some of the positive externalities that come from bigness.
Thank you.
Are there other questions in the chat? Let me see. Oh yeah, I see Sandra. Okay, so Sandra says that internet governance is not international, that ICANN and IETF don't involve representatives of national governments. They're global. That's, I said international, I should have said global. That's exactly right. So the distinction there is that they have global representation, but not from national nation states governments.
I actually had a
Go ahead.
question emailed to me.
Okay.
So what can we expect to be some of the earliest policy concerns when the work of CQN becomes available to private companies, being that the network will not be publicly available at first? Here, let me,
Yeah.
I could drop that in the chat, so that way if you need to read it.
So one reason I mentioned things like export controls is that I think that that's going to be the, part that will be among the issues that gives us headaches first. Figuring out openness versus closedness of research that has national security implications, and then also a whole bunch of other application, utility as well. Right. So if this sort of technology was only useful for signals intelligence or something, it would be an easier, there'd be a more legitimate reason to engage with secrecy and controls and whatnot. But what makes this hard is that the development of these types of technologies is going to be very useful in so many different ways. What else do you think is likely to come up earlier rather than later? Quantum sensing, I think is more likely. I mean, in a way, I'm not the best one to answer some of these questions, but quantum sensing, I think at least has some potential to have reduced prices earlier, and so therefore may affect the mining industry, for example. Sandra.
Yeah, thank you. I'm in response to the question you're just responding to. Might it not be the question of participatory decision making that we began to see in the science and innovation and technology decision making, and that began in the last couple decades of the 20th century in Europe, largely spurred by environmental concerns. But the argument has gained strength that if it's federal money, if it's national money that is funding this, and the consequences of it are going to be experienced by everyone, shouldn't all citizens be a part of the innovation process decision making? That might come early.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of model is already being incorporated to some extent in proposals related to AI fairness. So having, representative boards of stakeholders that represent different interests, various interests. So yeah, I think that's right. Great. Okay. Well, thank you. We're a little after 5 o'clock Eastern time, 2 o'clock Pacific. So I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane. That was a great talk. And for anybody who arrived a little bit late because of the issue with the link, this will go up on YouTube probably later this week. And I will be sending out a survey as well. And once we have our next talk settled for July, I will get all the information sent out for that. So hope to see everybody next month.